and I just started recording. So let me just say welcome to everyone who's here. Welcome to the Humankind series, which is presented by West Shore Community College. My name is Mike Nagel, and I teach history and political science here. And I'm really happy to be involved with tonight's event. If you're not familiar with it, Humankind is West Shore Community College's cultural arts and lecture series. The series includes events like tonight's panel, which will focus on the issue of supply chains. In the past, we've had events featuring West Shore faculty or other speakers, but the series also includes musical performances, art exhibits, and feature films. The focus for this year is around the concept of movement. Movement impacts our lives in many different ways, and tonight's presentation will focus on change or movement associated with supply chains. Now, I don't know about you, but supply chains is something that I didn't pay much attention to in the past, but for the last 2 years or so, we've all discovered, I think, how important it is, whether we're dealing with toilet paper, building supplies, or microchips for new or used vehicles. This evening's presentation involves a panel discussion with two experts in the field of supply chains. I'll go ahead and introduce each of the speakers now. First, we have Anthony D'Ambrosio, who is the Vice President of Business Development at Supply Chain Solutions. He's a graduate of the Pennsylvania State University and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Hotel and Restaurant Management. He's a logistics and supply chain leader with extensive experience in management and business operations. Also joining us tonight is Jason Brand. He studied business administration at Western Michigan University in Davenport. Jason's father, Les Brand, co-founded Supply Chain Solutions in 2001, and Jason began working as a forklift operator in the warehouse during his summer breaks in high school and college. He now serves as Director of Business Development. In just a minute, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our expert panelists, but I did want to let everyone know that after their presentation, we should have time for Q&A. If you do have questions, please post them in the chat function, and we'll try to address some of the questions that may come up during tonight's presentation. So gentlemen, take it away.
Mike, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Good evening. So just to recap some of the things that Mike said, I think it's important to understand that here at Supply Chain Solutions, we live and die by our communication successes and failures. So it is with special excitement that I am pleased to welcome Jason Brand, our Director of Business Development, who joins me this evening to speak to everyone about what supply chains are and how they affect our daily lives. As Mike said, Jason and his family have been in the logistics field their entire lives. His father, Les Brand, co-founded Supply Chain Solutions back in 2001 with our chairman, Jim Ward. And during his summer breaks in high school and college, Jason worked as a forklift operator in the local warehouses for our company. And as his career began to develop, he steadily rose through the ranks to become our Director of Business Development for the Midwest region of Supply Chain Solutions. And as Mike also said, Jason attended Western Michigan University and Davenport for business administration and plans to return to pursue his master's program at some point after his wedding this summer in June to his amazing fiancée, Lizzie, who is a nurse out in Michigan. And last but not least, as Mike mentioned, my name is Anthony D'Ambrosio. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Supply Chain Solutions. I began my journey in our industry 38 years ago after graduating Penn State University with a BA in Hotel and Restaurant Management. At that time, I did not know that supply chain would become my calling in life or my career. I grew up in the great fighting city of Philadelphia, famous for our cheesesteaks and the movie Rocky. I come from a family of fighters. My father was a professional fighter, and I too began to box as a teenager and continued while in college. Anecdotally, that first year at Penn State was very interesting because I had an A in partying and C's in most of my classes. But then something clicked and I became very focused on my education and my career aspirations. So just a few quick things about myself. I've been classically trained and involved in all aspects of supply chain, vessel operations, import, export, and project cargo. I'm a licensed master export specialist. I hold an IATA-FIATA license with the International Airline Transport Association. I am the Senior Hazardous Materials Specialist for the company, and I am a black belt in Lean Six Sigma. But enough boring things about me. I'd like to turn it over to my esteemed colleague and my weekly ship show co-host, Jason Brand, to say a few words before we jump into our presentation.
All right, Anthony, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Do you want to quick share the presentation and we will, that's perfect. All right. Yeah, so, okay. I mean, Anthony, I don't think I can top that. So thank you so much for the awesome introduction. Yeah, so to quick calibrate us, when we were first approached by West Shore Community College for the opportunity to speak about supply chain, Anthony and I pretty much gave an immediate yes to that offer. And I can confidently say that both of us were extremely excited for the chance to give more people an insight into our business sector. If you dial the clock back, we both started talking about the world of supply chain on a weekly informational show in the summer of last year. And it really began out of some very specific needs. We needed to remind our customers and we needed to remind the business community that their stuff was likely going to be late. And we needed to try to help them understand why that was going to be the case. I think we have a fantastic agenda for today, but if you really boil it down, I think our goals for you all are very similar. We need to explain to you why everything is so challenging right now. And to be able to do that, we need to explain what supply chains really are. Our industry on paper seems pretty simple. We get your stuff from point A to point B quickly and cost effectively. But at a consumer level, generally, you're shielded from the challenges, the risks, the costs, and the number of parties involved with international shipping. So think about an experience you've had going on and purchasing something on Amazon. You generally go buy something based on value. If you're an Amazon Prime member, it arrives the next day, and you don't get a separate bill for shipping and handling. But for the businesses supplying Amazon and for Amazon itself, the experience of getting you that package at a competitive price in such a short time frame is the company's single greatest challenge, and it's their single biggest expense. So take this example. In 2016, Amazon charged its customers over $8.9 billion between Prime memberships for free shipping and charging non-Prime members for shipping. But in the same year, the actual cost for Amazon to ship and fulfill all those packages was actually over $16.15 billion.
Wow.
So essentially, I know, right? It basically means Amazon knows its consumers don't understand the costs associated with shipping. And by charging for those costs, they'd be losing business to physical retail stores. So in my mind, the craziest part about this figure is back in 2016, we didn't have a pandemic. Shipping cost hadn't increased by 8 to 12 times in certain situations. And people still shopped at physical stores for most of their purchases. And it's safe to say that being in the supply chain industry, Anthony and I are both amazed daily that everything is still working after nearly 2 years of major disruptions. So anyway, getting back on track, Anthony, you want to run us through the agenda and we'll dive in a little bit deeper.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. And again, thank you, Mike. It truly is an honor to be able to speak to everyone tonight. And I have a quick question. I'm sure everyone knows the answer, but I'm sure that everyone has heard of Elon Musk. Give that a second to just sink in. And I think we all know that Elon Musk is an entrepreneur and a business magnate. He's the founder and CEO and chief engineer at SpaceX and the CEO and product architect of Tesla. He's the founder of the Boring Company and the co-founder of Neuralink and Open Artificial Intelligence. So what's really interesting is while Freight Armageddon was unfolding last year, as Jason and I called it, I was watching an interview on one of the local news channels of Elon Musk, and he was asked why so many of his production lines were shut down. And he talked about supply chain disruptions and bottlenecks and labor shortages and computer chip shortages. And then in mid-interview, he stopped, looked up, sort of up in the air, and he said, this supply chain stuff is really tricky. So I thought that would have been the perfect title for our presentation today, to tell you all about supply chain. This supply chain stuff is really tricky, and we're going to tell you why. But before we jump in, Jason and I would like to thank Mike Nagel and the entire team at the West Shore Community College for the opportunity to meet with everyone today, discuss what supply chains are, as well as the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains. Let's make no mistake, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the lives of people and business environments for many organizations around the globe. And it has highlighted the importance of being able to react, adapt, and set up crisis management mechanisms in order to weather situations of uncertainty. As the acute restrictions and lockdowns created many urgent situations over the last few years that required immediate attention in the early days of the pandemic, many companies have now begun to move to a recovery mode, and they have started planning for the longer term. So as companies seek to strengthen operations and business resilience, the importance of supply chain resilience and risk management is more important than ever. And leave it up to Elon Musk to say in just 7 words what it can take others thousands to describe. Musk is correct. The global supply chain is tricky. And one easy way to look at it is that the supply chain is like a spider's web within an infinite number of connections and offshoots moving across the globe. Even one connection, when interfered with, can have substantial consequences that affect everyone, causing a ripple effect all throughout the web. Supply chain issues can have a direct impact, not only with your business decisions, but also with your personal ones as well. So in today's presentation, Jason and I will try to answer the following questions. What is supply chain? What are the issues causing supply chain disruptions? How the supply chain crisis unfolded. So we'll tell you how it unfolded, how we can connect these issues to everyday life in America. Also, how the pandemic has affected supply chains, and what we think we can expect for supply chains in 2022. And as always, after that, we'll have some Q&A, as Mike said, and Jason and I will always be available for everyone. This presentation is going to go out to Mike, and he can share it with anyone and everyone, and we'll always be here to answer any of your questions. But with that, I would like to turn this over to Jason to talk to you about what supply chain is, and then we'll look at a short video. Jason, take it away.
All right, so what supply chain is? Big question. I'll quick read you what's on the slide, and we'll watch the video, and then I'll kind of give you a little bit of I got a question. So a supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to the final buyer. This network includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. The supply chain also represents the steps it takes to get a product or service from its original state to the customer. Companies develop supply chains so they can reduce their costs and remain competitive in the business landscape. So let's take a quick look at this video, and I've got a question for you afterwards.
Here we go.
What is the supply chain? The supply chain begins with a person or business who wants to make and ship a product. They must first secure a supply of the necessary raw materials to complete their vision. The raw materials are then sent to a manufacturer to be processed and assembled. The finished product is then taken and shipped by air, land, or sea to the geographic location where it is to be sold. There, it is stored in a warehouse, where it sits as inventory until a sale is made, whether to a business for resale or directly to an individual.
You know, what's so funny about that video, Anthony? When we watch that, I think about it in two ways. How each one of those steps has a whole nother layer of things to it.
Absolutely.
And how sometimes watching that, it almost oversimplifies it as well. So here's my, I got a little bit of stint. Here's my question. Have you ever wondered why Apple has its screens made in China by a totally separate company?
It's a great question.
Right? And then maybe you assumed truck rims were made here in the States, but actually a large portion of them are made in India. Have you wondered why generally your clothes are made in Vietnam or Cambodia? Well, to kind of dive into it for a second, I think the general consensus has been it's cheaper because of labor laws or because of the currency exchange, but I want you to try not to think so specifically. How could it possibly be cheaper to transport something on the other side of the world to your door rather than buying something from a local store that was made in your town? And now, I've not been to the other side of the world in the past 2 years, but the last time I went to China, it was $1,600 just to transport myself between two airports. So how could this be cheaper? Simply put, without the help of sometimes up to a dozen different companies in a single shipment, it definitely would not be cheaper. So I want you to quick think about the process after manufacturing. That shirt you bought that was made in Vietnam was produced, then it was packaged, then it was stored, was loaded by someone onto a truck, driven to a warehouse, combined with other products, then loaded onto a container. The Vietnamese government and the US government needed to negotiate the share of revenue the US will make for that product entering the country. And they also need to agree that the product isn't going to harm the economy by being too much of a competitive advantage for the buyer. Someone has to manually confirm all of this 2 times for both governments. From there, it's going to spend a little bit less than a month on the water crossing the Pacific Ocean. It needs to be unloaded, reloaded, married to a chassis or to a rail car or to both, shipped likely to Chicago, wait in a rail car, be picked up by a trucking company, dropped at a third-party warehouse, stored, and finally picked, packed, and shipped, and then to the retailer, or hopefully to you by that point. And you know, the most important thing to realize is that each of these touch points, there's a bill, and all of those touch points combined equal your shipping and handling fee. So what is so funny to me about this is that somehow we've gotten so good at our jobs that it's actually cheaper to buy that shirt from Vietnam than it is to pick it up from your local manufacturer. So, all right, Anthony, that's all I have to say. Dive into the issues.
Oh, Jason, what a way to unpack that. I like it. And I think another great analogy about supply chain is it's like an onion. The more layers you peel, the more that there are. But I think what we should know is what are the issues causing supply chain disruption for the last 2.5 years. So with that, Jason and I decided to get together and do a little bit of roundtable and basically lay out the issues for you. So first and foremost, the pandemic. Okay, the pandemic has changed supply chain irrevocably moving forward. It will never go back to the way it was in 2019. So we have the pandemic, unprecedented consumer demand since lockdowns started to dissipate, things started to open back up again. Consumers were buying, Amazon, eBay, buying online more than ever. Of course, port disruptions, congestion, bottlenecks. And it's unfortunate that the public only in the last few months has really started to hear about these port disruptions and congestions and bottlenecks. But this is not something that's new in supply chain. Of course, we have labor shortages, shortages of components and raw materials, lack of warehousing and distribution centers, shortage of truck drivers and equipment. And then, of course, the structural inefficiencies in port operations around the country. So even though the United States is still in the top tier of, structural supply chain layouts in terms of how ports are laid out, the type of shore cranes we have, the infrastructure and things like that, we still have a long way to go. So we have a little video here that will tell you in form of a video what caused the great global supply chain disruption. So let's play our video, folks. Please enjoy it.
Clogged cargo ports, backlogged rail yards, empty shelves, the list goes on. 18 months after the onset of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions are still showing up in every corner of the world. But is the pandemic the only cause? Or is this the new normal? And how will supply chains hold up in the future?
The reality is that the pandemic really exacerbated underlying issues that's been present in many supply chains. Some of those issues are fragmented supply chains. Absolutely, lack of visibility and collaboration is a problem that many supply chains face. And then if you think about understanding risk and supplier performance and measuring that, you have many companies that weren't on that journey. And what you're seeing now is the exposure of those underlying risks driven by the pandemic.
Procurement issues are adding to the challenge. Goods cannot be produced or delivered. Manufacturers and distributors lack raw materials, key components, or workers.
The fact remains there will be another geopolitical event. There will be another major weather issue. And we will run into labor shortages, all of which can disrupt a fragmented supply chain.
Technology can help companies be more resilient and proactive in mitigating present and future risks.
With SAP, we can help you put into place those resilient processes, practices built on top of our procurement, our travel and expense management, our external workforce management solutions, and of course, the SAP Business Network to help you be ready for that future of tomorrow.
Sustainability plays a key role in building a better tomorrow, helping companies balance the bottom line with the green line.
Now's the time to think about how you're sourcing. Now's the time to think about how you're introducing visibility into your supply chain to help understand where you have inefficient processes that's contributing to increased emissions. Now's the time to work hand in hand with your suppliers to reduce your carbon footprint. It's fairly safe to say this is not the last that we will see of supply chain disruption.
In times of uncertainty, resilient and sustainable supply chains will define the survival and success of businesses and the world.
So while we appreciate the marketing side of the SAP video, I thought it was a great video for everyone to see because they just hit the nail right on the head on some of the things that caused the great supply chain disruption. So with that, I'd like to segue into our next portion of the presentation and basically go through how the supply chain crisis unfolded. Jay, did you have anything you wanted to comment on after that video?
Yeah. Do you mind if I want to quick talk about one of the things above?
Sure.
And I want you to run right through it because you're going to do such
Sure.
a detailed job. So basically, I want to talk about, there's an element up there that I feel like is pretty trackable. It's pretty tangible. It's really easy to understand out of the items that, essentially we just reviewed. So to set the stage, you've got to think about the way we buy things, or at least the way that we used to buy things. You really got to view your experience or our experience of buying things from businesses as a multi-channel experience. And what I mean by this is that there's different ways to buy things, and there's different ways that companies can recognize demand for their goods. Prior to the pandemic, brick and mortar or retail stores still were a dominant channel in this buying system, even though sales were starting to make a big shift to online. When the pandemic struck, nearly all of the buying power in the physical store channel was forced into the online channel. And at that same time, families saw a boost in their disposable income. We had the stimulus payments. Also, their gyms were closing. They had no need to buy gas since they were likely working from home, and now no ability to go on vacation or even simply go out to eat. And these families used this extra money to start buying things. And predominantly, the things that those families bought arrived via the West Coast ports. So the fact that this initial backlog happened on the holiday season in 2020 was never cleared up. It started with around 17 ships waiting at berth, and now it's turned into over 100. So it's sometimes hard to understand why this is so challenging, but you have to look at everything with kind of an economist viewpoint of scarcity. It's not necessarily the backlog of ships that's the real problem. It's the fact that the ships are waiting. And by waiting, they aren't being used. And it's also the fact that millions of containers are tied up waiting on those ships to be unloaded. So the real dilemma here is the unseen ripple effects that cause things like the container shortage and as well as raw material shortages. And it's when these ripple effects take one bottleneck, such as the West Coast ports, and they cause another, such as the container shortage, that's when the problem starts to become exponential. And that's exactly what's happened over the past 2 years. So while US businesses, they've been having accounting challenges of paid for goods not being available for sale well beyond their normal credit terms, the upstream challenges are creating these much harder to solve dilemmas. And really they're economy changing challenges. All right, Anthony, back to you. You take the whole run through.
No, Jason, you are awesome always. I love your keen insights. I feel like we're doing the ship show like we did earlier today, but just to give everyone a quick high-level overview of how the crisis unfolded. So let me go through this. There's several bullet points, and then we'll segue over to Jason. So ships were stuck at sea, warehouses were overflowing, trucks were without drivers. The highly intricate and interconnected global supply chain is in upheaval and is still in upheaval today. So with little end in sight, we are now in the recovery mode, essentially, supply chain companies and, American businesses. The turmoil has revealed, though, how the need to ship. So, for example, all of this turmoil has revealed how the need to ship surgical masks to West Africa from China can have a cascading effect on Ford's ability to back up cameras on its cars or factories in Ohio and delay the arrival of Amazon Prime orders in Florida in time for the holidays. I thought that was sort of an interesting analogy, how, there's a ripple effect. And in one way or another, much of the crisis can be traced to the outbreak of COVID-19. So when the pandemic struck in early 2020, people and businesses were quickly forced to restrict their activity, sending the global economy into a brief but damaging free fall. And as offices and stores closed and factories from Asia and Europe and North America halted production, companies laid off workers en masse, and that took spending power, which is an economic life force, out of people's hands. So with fewer goods being made and fewer people with paychecks to spend, manufacturers and shipping companies assumed that demand would drop sharply, but a far more complicated situation unfolded, challenging the entire global supply chain. So in early 2020, the entire planet suddenly needed surgical masks and gowns and other protective gear, PPE, personal protective equipment. Most of these goods were made in China, which produced half of the protective masks the year before. So as Chinese factories ramped up to meet the new demand, cargo vessels delivered protective gear around the globe, even to regions that do relatively little trade with China, such as West Africa. Now, China's factories were pumping out goods in record volume. So despite the worry that economic devastation would destroy spending in many countries, the pandemic merely shifted that demand. So instead of eating out or attending concerts or events or, seeing friends and going for, a glass of wine or a beer, Americans bought office furniture and electronics and kitchen appliances instead of, all these other things they were used to doing. So, the pandemic sharply accelerated a trend that had been advancing for years. the shift towards online shopping that Jason was just talking about. So from April to June of 2020, as the first wave of the virus spread, Amazon sold 57% more items than it had the year before. I mean, think about it. 57% more items than it had the year before. That's just, that's a financial boom for Amazon. And, the spending in the United States was also encouraged by government stimulus programs that mailed checks to households. And part of a record-setting effort to resuscitate the economy as well. So households collectively received hundreds of billions in recovery aid. Many businesses were also hurting. And as financially sound this supply chain solution is, I know that we also, did things under the CARES Act to help our business as well, to make sure that we could keep and retain all of our employees and make sure that they had a paycheck and, they could put food on the table for their families and gas in their vehicles. So, the CARES Act that was put in place by Congress was a great thing. But as demand increased, a wave of factory goods swiftly overwhelmed the U.S. ports. With too many ships arriving at once, boats had to wait at times in 100 vessel queues off the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Okay, so in the United States, real quick, the number one ports are the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, New York, Norfolk, and Savannah, Georgia, with Houston coming in fifth. And the swelling orders also outstrip the availability of shipping containers. And it's also anecdotally important to note that there are only 4 companies in the world that make shipping containers, and 3 of them are located in China. So you want to talk about a monopoly, okay? And the cost of shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles skyrocketed tenfold. And just to give you an example, folks, back in 2019, to ship a 40-foot container from Hong Kong to Los Angeles, it only cost $1,800. Right now, it's about $20,000. And in the middle of the meltdown last year, while Freight Armageddon was unfolding, it even peaked close to $27,000. So you want to talk about inflation and supply chain, that's part of the issue right now. But even once unloaded, these containers piled up on docks unclaimed because of a shortage of truck drivers from the pandemic. Who needed to haul cargo to warehouses. And these truck drivers had long been scarce even before the pandemic. People take for granted that all of these great men and women who are driving these long haul trucks around the country, delivering all the goods that we all purchase on a daily basis in our lives, we take that for granted, but there really has been a shortage of drivers, okay? And, with wages steadily eroding over the years amid these grueling working conditions, we sort of were in the perfect storm here. So businesses across the economy have struggled to hire workers at warehouses, at retailers, at construction companies, and even for other skilled trades. So even as employers resorted to lifting wages, labor shortages persisted, worsening the scarcity of goods. And just to give you a perspective, the average truck driver made between $50,000 and $62,000 a year. People that are driving trucks now are making close to $80,000 to $90,000 to $100,000 a year. And it's a really tough job because many of these truck drivers who are transporting goods, say from LA to Chicago, or driving across country all the way to New York, are sometimes on the road for a month at a time, and they're away from their families for long periods of time. So it's a tough job, but the shortages of one thing have turned into shortages of others. And a dearth of computer chips, for example, has forced major automakers to slash production. while even delaying the manufacture of medical devices, just to put it in perspective for everyone. So as businesses and consumers have reacted to the shortages by ordering earlier and extra, especially ahead of the year-end holidays, that has placed even more strain on the system as we came to the end of 2020-21. So even as the pandemic catalyzed it, the crisis has roots in a production model pioneered by Toyota at the end of World War II. And that's sort of the roots of Lean Six Sigma, okay? And, you know, it's disseminated throughout the business world. And under the model called just-in-time manufacturing, companies stockpile a few raw materials and parts as possible instead of buying what they need. Okay, so that was the old way of procurement managers at companies ordering their goods and services. They would order just in time. So as those shelves running out in your Target store or your Meijer store of certain goods were just about to run out, they would time it so the next wave of their goods could hit the shelves without a disruption. Now, that works only when they can get what they need when they need it. But for years, some experts have warned that the global economy is over-reliant on lean production and faraway factories. And this exposed, and you know, everyone was exposed to this inevitable shock. And the pandemic has seemingly validated that view. So, you know, this past holiday season, you know, with the holiday shopping season, you know, just having been completed towards the end of last year, and the Biden administration pressing to force major ports to expand operations so, you know, consumers could get their goods on time. Unfortunately, that just didn't work out. Despite all the great efforts of the Biden administration, the disruption and the bottlenecks were just too much. So the supply chain has become a central political issue, unfortunately. And it's also a key factor in rising inflation right now, which is a deepening concern about the fate of the global economy and its recovery from the lockdowns of the pandemic. So the supply chain issues that we experienced in the last 2 years are likely to last for the remainder of this, you know, for this year, if not into next year for sure. And before I turn it back over to Jason, we put together a little flow chart here that kind of illustrates what happened. So, you know, at the top, you'll see the pandemic. And then we had economic slowdowns as a result of lockdowns. There was a reduction of shipping. There were reductions in component shortages. There were, you know, pandemic layoffs, you know, production slowdowns, labor shortages, strained supply chains, you know, shortages of shipping containers in the exporting countries, you know, China exports of PPE equipment to all corners of the world further exasperated the system. So, I mean, and then of course, everyone going out and just ordering like crazy online, it just created again this perfect storm. And the just-in-time model of manufacturing just couldn't hold up or pass the litmus test. So, you know, I want to apologize for being a little long-winded about how it unfolded, but I think it was important for everyone to understand specifically how it unfolded. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jason so he can tell you how we can connect these issues to everyday life in America. Jason, back to you.
Honestly, I think that you did a great job with that section because it's, and I think you did a really good job explaining, you know, how complex the issue was. And it's not just, you really can't pin it on one thing, because I know you and I specifically have been asked so many times over the past, 8 months, what was the main thing that happened that caused all of this? What caused this? How can we fix this? All of these kind of A/B thinking, and it's really a lot more complex than that. And it's not one solution; it's a whole series of solutions. So yeah, I think you did an awesome job with that.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. You're welcome. So I'm going to definitely take a different view on this than Anthony is on how we connect these to everyday life in America. But you know, I kind of want to think about it this way. So the main challenge we're facing, and Anthony kind of touched on this, is we are going to be facing rising costs, and it's something you're going to start seeing across the board. So to kind of put a stake in the ground, I guess, back in 2016, we implemented a series of taxes on imported Chinese goods. These were called the 301 tariffs, and they're still around today. The average cost increase from these taxes added for Chinese purchased products was huge. So it averaged around an additional 20 to 25%. And that's on top of any other existing tariffs or taxes that were already on those goods. Now, up until last year, a lot of companies were eating those charges. But when you combine those extra bottom line costs with all of the expensive challenges happening in the world of shipping today, manufacturers and retailers simply have to hit a point where they need to pass those charges on to the end consumer. So there was a study done late last fall, and it was itemizing what goods would be hit hardest by these increases. And it really does need to be revived. Again, there was a few things I didn't agree with, but one thing I really did agree with is luxury goods in particular are going to go up quite a lot in cost. So it itemized leather goods going up at least 11% this year, but you are going to be seeing costs across the board rise as well. So from a consumer point of view, what are some other things you could expect to see, and what's going to be the result of these challenges? So what I would keep my eye on is how your products and packages start to change. I think you'll start to see tin cans replaced with cardboard containers simply because they're lighter, they're more densely shipped. Products like the PS5, which I don't know anybody who's able to get a hold of one, but likely you're going to see those get redesigned to be smaller and lighter. We already saw Apple removing the charger from their iPhone boxes, which nearly half the size of the package. But this is really just the beginning. And I can expect companies to start using more locally sourced raw materials in their products to avoid leaning so heavily on the international shipping market. So Anthony, what do you think for your takes that we can kind of compare to?
Well, I mean, Jason, those were, again, it's always great to work with you because you always have your finger on the pulse of these type of things. But, I think as we say here in our, as we're illustrating here in our presentation, pandemic era supply chain issues are now top of the mind for most Americans. So rapid fire, real quick, 87% of the people have been negatively impacted by supply chain issues over the past year. And, as it says here in the presentation, many Americans unable to purchase certain items due to shortages, and they were forced to cancel orders due to delays. We've got a question in the queue here where one of our participants here in today's webinar ordered bike racks and 2 trail bikes last year, and they still haven't received the goods. And, the dealer can't even tell them when these items are expected to come in. So this is the kind of thing that has been going on in our industry and in the global supply chain for a long time. And, before the COVID outbreak, it seems that few people even gave a thought to the impact of supply chains on their daily lives. But again, as we illustrate here, 45% of citizens say that the idea never crossed their mind until the pandemic. But that all has changed over the past year, though, as 91% now take supply chain into account when they make a purchase, because they're afraid they won't be able to, purchase that same item again. And because nearly all Americans, 92%, believe that the disruptions in supply chains will happen again, almost the same amount, 91%, expect to change their buying behavior to account for these issues. Specifically, some of the actions they plan on taking include buying in bulk and stocking up on more items 49% of the people that we polled said that. Purchasing gifts earlier to allow for delays, 45%. I mean, it's almost half. You know, paying closer attention to the global shortages of items they often use, 40%. Pre-ordering when possible, again, 39%. That's close to 40%. And then shopping more in person than online. Okay, so along with many profound changes that affect everyday life in America, COVID-19 and the responses to it have accelerated our use of certain words and phrases. So when you think about this, everybody might kind of get a little chuckle, but our common everyday vocabulary now has been altered. And among the additions are social distancing, getting boosted, flattening the curve. Then there's an older and more familiar term, which after a long hiatus is once again seen and heard frequently. Supply chain problems now command a lot of attention. So at a glance, you know, trend lines in Federal Reserve data combined with, you know, Jason and my own look into some of these numbers tell us a few things. That in the spring of 2021, retail sales jumped 40% on a year-over-year basis. New auto sales jumped by more than 100%. Auto parts and productions jumped almost 300%, and exports from China to the United States rose roughly 100%. Those are mind-boggling numbers. And these massive reactions, representing exploding demand for more than just about everything, stress production facilities and supply chain elements far and wide. This put a tremendous strain on every link in the supply chain. You know, and search as we may, there's nothing like a sudden increase in demand and stress on the supply chain. You know, we haven't seen this since post-World War II. So it's really amazing to see what has happened here. And this is to be expected, though, because once Americans have spent the money burning holes in their bank accounts, pre-pandemic supply chain capacity may again start to look adequate for many goods. And rising inflation may also temper the urge to keep spending and stressing the supply chains. And we talked about it today, Jason and I. One of the main drivers that is going to, you know, it's not until consumer demand wanes that we will see, you know, we won't see supply chain disruptions stop until the demand really, you know, plateaus. Okay. And it's just been exponentially increasing since, you know, we opened up from the lockdowns. And this is really truly causing the greatest stress on the supply chain. And, you know, until COVID, we did not seem to have a supply chain crisis. So what really happened and where do we stand right now? And I think Jason will tell us a little bit now how the pandemic affected supply chains, and he'll approach that. So Jason, back to you.
Yeah, Anthony, fantastic job. And I'm seeing some of these questions run through and I love these. I'm working with a bike retailer right now, actually a bike retailer over in Wisconsin. And so that's just a really interesting question. But okay, so Anthony, do you actually mind doing this section first? Because I think you've got some awesome points on this one. And I want to comment on some of them. So run through.
Okay, so let me go through. So since the emergence of the coronavirus in early 2020, supply chains across the world drastically slowed down for a variety of reasons, including but not limited to disrupted shipping lanes, labor and material shortages, and fluctuating demand. Global markets face many unknowns as supply chains return to normal. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has posed significant challenges for supply chains globally. Multiple national lockdowns continue to slow or even temporarily stop the flow of raw materials and finished goods, disrupting manufacturing as a result. However, the pandemic has not necessarily created any new challenges for supply chains. Some of these things that have been going on in supply chain in the last couple of years have been going on behind the scenes for years, but they were never exasperated like they are now. And in some areas, it brought to light previously unseen vulnerabilities in our infrastructure and in our supply chain processes. And of course, many organizations have suffered staff shortages and losses due to COVID-19, but overall, it has accelerated and magnified problems that already existed in the supply chain. And the pandemic has had a substantial negative effect on supply chains. So here are our top 4 global supply chain issues that explain why the pandemic's impact on global trade is so devastating. But before we go to that, did you want me to go through that, Jay, or did you want to just...
Honestly, because that's the thing, you've hit so many points that are just already so on the money. And yeah, I mean, really, the basis that I really want to emphasize right now is that the pandemic's brought a lot of strain on every link in the supply chain. And as a result, it's highlighted all of these vulnerabilities we have in the current infrastructure. So take, for example, trucking, something I feel like on the surface doesn't seem as much of a looming issue as container ships larger than the Eiffel Tower trying to find a parking spot. But trucking's actually been in a bad place for years. And the average age of a truck driver is in the late 50s, which means a lot of them are headed towards retirement soon, and it's causing its own set of issues. So the pandemic and the travel bans that came along with it brought attention to cross-border trucking, and with that came things like the vaccine mandate. And to be honest, if any elected official had been paying close enough attention to the trucking market, they would have known the vaccine mandate was not going to blow over well. So back in 2018, we had a very different mandate that was pushed through the trucking market. It was called the electronic logging device mandate, and it was terrible. It caused a wave of drivers to leave the trucking industry permanently. We had a whole domestic shipping issue happen around that mandate. And, you know, obviously people really weren't paying attention to that. But the point is, we have vulnerabilities at every link in the chain, and warehouses, they can't hire enough people to hand these substantially higher throughputs or justify a third shift. The rail system is just hopelessly expensive, and you know, it needs major investment. And then the ports need to be substantially more automated, but pushback from labor unions has really prevented this for years. So I'd like to say we're close to the end of this pandemic, but I mean, just last month, there was more COVID positive cases at the ports of LA and Long Beach throughout, like just last month, there was more COVID positive cases at those ports than all of last year. So, you know, I think the point here is that the pandemic's lowered our ability to handle cargo of all forms around the world, and that the backlog, you know, that was a result of that has further handicapped us in our ability to provide reliable and cost-effective solutions going forward. So we're in kind of a stalemate right now is how we progress. Anthony, you wanna go on further now?
No, Jason, thank you so much. Those are excellent points. And as we were talking about, you know, these top 4 global supply chain issues explain why the pandemic's impact on global trade is so devastating. So number 1, geographical scope. No previous natural disaster has impacted the entire global population the way COVID has. Then we have the industrial scope. Most disasters and other disruptions affect a handful of industries directly and others indirectly. But COVID-19's impact is felt firsthand by all industries and all markets. Make no mistake. And then, as I talked about just a few minutes ago, demand chain. Demand for high-end items has dried up as consumers with high disposable incomes chose to cancel or delay planned purchases of luxury items like, you know, big screen TVs and really expensive cars and things like that. You know, I myself last year wanted to go out and buy a new car, and the car I wanted, I couldn't get it. They were, you know, they don't have the computer chips to put in the cars because there's a shortage of raw materials and chips, you know. And then, of course, lastly, duration. Okay, so even natural disasters are devastating, as the earthquakes and the tsunamis that struck in Indonesia in 2004 and in Fukushima, Japan in 2011. And most take most nations only a few years to recover from them. These type of natural disasters really only took a few years to recover, but COVID-19's impact on the global supply chain and the economies is suspected to be felt for a decade or longer. So let me just say that again. It's expected to be felt for at least another decade, and it changed how we, as supply chain, people that work in supply chain, how we run our business. The whole industry has been fundamentally changed. So let's talk about next what we can expect for supply chains in 2022. So Jay, I don't know if you want to jump into that slide, or do you want me to take it?
You take that slide.
Thank you, guys. So what can we expect? So 2021 was the year of supply chain entered the public lexicon, okay? That's when it became the great buzzword. And no one knows for sure what might have happened to the supply chain in 2022, but it's a complex brew with far too many variables outside of anyone's control. Inflation, which we're experiencing now, geopolitical challenges like Ukraine that's unfolding just in the last 48 hours, and the ongoing pandemic, to name a few, are colluding to create a murky vision for this year. So with all that said, here are some of the possible outcomes as we start to come to the end of our presentation. So unfortunately, I hate to tell everyone, the chaos is going to continue. Last year, Jason and I coined the phrase Freight Armageddon. And then about halfway through the year, we changed that to the Great Supply Chain Disruption of 2021, because it is going to go down in history as one of the greatest disruptions in supply chain in the world, in history. So here are the top 5 risks for 2022. So a lot of people don't realize it, but there's a worldwide water instability issue. 2/3 of the global population will face water shortages by 2025, and we're talking about drinking water. A steady water supply is necessary not only for drinking, but for production and cooling equipment, so pharmaceuticals can be made, tech products can be made, paper, garments, food processing, and other manufacturing industries, just to name a few. Again, we have ocean freight bottlenecks, okay? These are going to still persist for a while. The fact that we've been facing record low inventory levels and strong consumer demand and ongoing COVID-19 impacts on logistics and the workforce, the global ocean cargo industry will continue to suffer from port congestion and bottlenecks and disruptions throughout the majority of this year. As a matter of fact, folks, we don't expect to see a glimmer of light until the 4th quarter of this year, okay? And then again, the continuously changing workplace. As the Omicron variant of COVID-19 spreads across the world, the risk of infection will force companies to reassess how workplace safety and worker compensation rolls out to avoid the risk of losing long-term disruptions from industrial actions or outbreaks of disease. And it's a big issue right now. I can tell you right now, at least half of our 200 plus associates at Supply Chain Solutions are working remotely, okay? And then we will shift from just in time to just in case. And remember, we spoke about just-in-time shipping earlier in the presentation. So the pandemic exposed flaws in just-in-time inventory systems, and businesses have begun exploring a shift to the just-in-case model. So heaven forbid we should have another pandemic or another major geopolitical event. The buzzword now, the buzz, I don't want to say word, but the next shoe they say to drop is a gray swan event with China and Taiwan, which would really throw the global supply chain into chaos. So companies are increasing the buffer and the safety stocks of critical components and materials for their best-selling products to avoid these sort of disruptions in the future. And then lastly, increased regulatory scrutiny. So sustainability disclosure and reporting requirements for business continue to gain momentum amid the security from governments, investors, and consumers alike. So, as the pandemic heated up, all of the different regulatory agencies within supply chain started to have more oversight. U.S. Customs, FDA, USDA, Fish and Wildlife, FCC, okay? So again, a lot of scrutiny and further regulations and regulators impacted global supply chains. And this is likely going to, continue in 2022 and beyond. But with that, I think Jason will like to talk about what are the top supply chain trends for 2022 as we finally come to the end of our presentation. So Jason, why don't you take these next couple of slides if you like, and add anything else you'd care to.
It's kind of hard to follow you up when you have such, so much information you're sending out here. I can't compete. Anyway, yeah, so basically take a look at these slides. We'll actually send this out to you, Mike, so you can send this to all your students. I think it might even be easier for you guys to take a look at this. Honestly, Anthony, I am eager to dive into some of these questions because TM, I really want to discuss his bike issues he's having because they are interesting and they've got a lot of facets. Do you want to say something on this before we move to questions?
Sure. So let's just go through this real quick. So 3 key supply chain trends that you need to know about. So the supply chain areas with the highest outsourcing are distribution, logistics, manufacturing, finishing goods, and packaging. The big trends, though, because the industry now, everyone is switching to is going to be digitalized. Okay, the digitalization of logistics is front and foremost right now. Blockchain technologies are becoming a priority in the supply chain industry. I can tell you that Supply Chain Solutions is getting ready to roll out our new client portal, and it's going to be powered by Project 44 and predictive analytics and artificial intelligence. It's truly amazing. And when you have time, you could look at this slide and see some of the things here that are going to be really important, like the Internet of Things and cloud computing and predictive analytics and things like that. And of course, we also tell you about the extent of supply chain visibility among the organizations. And you really can see how many organizations, you'd be surprised, 62% of them have limited visibility. And then of course, we talk a little bit about circular supply chains here, which is another great slide that shows you how the materials flow through the supply chain. And then lastly, lifestyle thinking. Okay, life cycle thinking. And as we look to the new year, companies are recognizing the need to be better prepared for the likely event of further disruption. And life cycle thinking and sustainability is extremely important as it relates to the environmental concerns and the growing customers and partner expectations and the influence of these decisions. So I think we look forward to these trends on the horizon for 2022 and beyond. And, with that though, with these considerations in mind, 2022 will resemble many of the issues and trends experienced in 21. And I think everyone can say, having lived through COVID and these disruptions, we made some necessary adjustments. We've learned, and now we're better prepared for whatever the future may bring. And with that, we come to the end of our presentation, and I want to send it back to Mike, our esteemed colleague, and we hope we did not bore you with our presentation, everyone.
Well, I would say that no way did we get bored with that. I mean, there's so much information and it's so complicated. There's so many moving parts. And Jason, as you had kind of suggested, there's some questions here. So maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen and then so that everybody can see you. So Jason, did you want to talk about some of the, address some of the questions that are in here?
Yeah, definitely. And TM, I'm gonna kind of be I want to kind of talk to yours because yours is actually really interesting, and I totally understand your frustration as well. So first, I know it's the leisure activity, but I want to I just want to kind of dive into this. You're comparing the the local businesses to your big box retailers, and the problem with that is the experience each of those businesses are having with the disruption that's going on right now is very different. So when you have like a Lowe's, for example, Lowe's has a ton of containers in the water at any period of time. The amount of money they're spending on a container compared to a small bike shop is totally different. And when we look at like what the cost is for shipping right now, the cost for, Costco, not the shipping line, but Costco, the, your massive retail outlet, is substantially cheaper than it is for the cost of your mom and pop shop if they did order a 40-foot container at this point. And it's because they have so much cargo in the system that they're able to negotiate much lower rates, or they have enough buying power that they can do things like Costco did, chartered their own ocean vessel and brought in their own containers because they just weren't having it. So, when you make that comparison, it's a little bit challenging, right? Because, for example, Lowe's controls they're an organization that's very keen on controlling every piece of the supply chain. A lot of companies like those mom and pop shops, actually what's going to happen is Trek is going to control the shipping. And so it's going to be shipped via Trek's mechanisms, right? And that's not going to be as effective as a retail outlet here in the US bringing goods in. They're going to have more controls on that. So unfortunately, I definitely applaud you for, the route you're going and wanting to support local businesses, but sometimes it can be challenging for them to compete with the big box retailers when it comes to getting at least attention by the shipping companies. Now, with bikes in particular, and this is another point I wanted to talk about, we're working with a bike retailer right now, and we got a masterclass on bicycle logistics. And let me tell you, it's a niche market, and not a lot of logistics providers are in that market because it's challenging. You ship bikes unassembled, and they have to be very specifically assembled to make them quality, brand new products, essentially. So the way they're shipped and some of the precautions that have to be taken and where they're shipped to, very specific. There's not a lot of locations. And especially when you're buying, Trek is a larger brand, actually as far as logistics goes, a more established brand, but some of your other brands aren't as good at getting their products out there. So right now it's a market space that's actually blowing up. So I don't want to talk too much, but let me just make sure, TM, that I'm kind of touching on some of this other stuff. So talking about the plow for the driveway, well, I can recommend go over to go over to Home Depot and buy an Ego product, because we service those and we know we can get you one in no time at all. Anthony, you want to dive into some of these questions?
Sure, I would love to. So, TM said, what's really behind all of this? Of course, there is that unprecedented consumer demand. That is really one of the biggest drivers. I can tell you, when the pandemic first started happening, I've been married for 29 years, and, literally my wife and I would go out maybe, once or twice a week just to do, basic grocery shopping. There wasn't a lot to do. We did projects around our house that, and we, we had gotten wedding gifts that we forgot we even, received. We were doing so many projects. And, when you think about it, people were just stuck in their homes, stuck to the news, only going out for the necessary supplies. And then when those lockdowns were lifted, boy, things just started exploding, from a consumer perspective. But, if I may take this a step further, I'm a little bit more conspiratorial about it, because I think a lot of the inflation we're seeing right now in our economy and in supply chain has a lot to do with the central banks. And I believe personally, over the next several years, then we are really going to shift to a digital currency. I've had this conversation with a lot of friends and colleagues, and they say, boy, whatever you're reading, you better stop it. But I really think digital currencies, I think the fiat currency, which is any currency backed by debt, is dying. The central banks are dying. They're exasperating shipping costs in supply chain. I think there's a lot of governments around the world that are in collusion, especially the container ship, what I like to call the container ship cartels. Okay. You have all of these container shipping lines, and now they formed 3 alliances. So within each alliance, you have the alliance, you have the 2M, you have ONE, Ocean Network. I forget what the E stands for, my apologies. But, they're a consortium of container ship lines. And really, we believe that's why there's an investigation right now by the Federal Maritime Commission into collusion between the container ship lines, where they have really jack these shipping costs up. Some importers, sometimes someone may only have, we have a large furniture importer in Manhattan. Their 40-foot containers only contain the value of one of their containers of furniture for children, strollers, cribs, baby furniture, may only be $14,000-$15,000 in value, but it's costing them. Last year, in the middle of Freight Armageddon, it was costing them $25,000 or $26,000 to ship it into New York. Okay, so consumers were losing money. So, what's behind it? It is the pandemic. That was the catalyst that I believe the central banks used to usher in this mess that we're in right now. Now, I know that's a little conspiratorial, but that's my spin on it.
Well, and I think there's a couple really, really amazing points in there too. So for example, when you look at the container ship cartels, as we like to call them, but it is really, it does get a little bit hairy because they form these alliances. They're under international business. So it gets a little bit more difficult to pursue, any type of solution. But what was the company that made more profit? Which one of the
it was Maersk, Maersk Shipping Line, which is the largest carrier in the world.
Was it 1 year or was it less than a year? I think it was one quarter, wasn't it?
Well, they made more money in 1 year than they did in the last 10 years.
And it was not only them, it was their whole alliance in the last 10
whole
years.
Alliance.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So if you just look at the amount of, and that was profit. That was not revenue. That was not vanity. That was actual profit. And so, I understand the forces of supply and demand are at play. And we discuss this all the time because this is something that supply chains live and die on. I mean, capacity is king, I guess, really is the way of putting it. But these costs are well beyond what they should be given the demand, right? I mean, if you think that we haven't been hit by adjustments due to inflation yet, it gets a little challenging. But I think you made some really excellent points there, Anthony.
No,
So I wonder,
Mike,
I wonder if we can try to address Tom's question about, do you think that the issues that you've been talking about have been severe enough to shift us back to manufacturing as much as possible in the United States?
Mike, thank you for bringing that back into focus because I saw Tom's question and I wanted to talk about that, and I know Jason would too. So in November of last year, we did one of our ship shows and we talked about near sourcing, resourcing, and best sourcing. And a lot of companies now, are looking at ways to bring production back to the United States and bring production to countries that are going to be more friendly. The whole situation that was exasperated with the trade war with China, with what I like to call the Trump tariffs, really just poured fuel on the fire. So, now we see companies moving away from China in droves, going to countries like Mexico and India and Bangladesh and Brazil and Sri Lanka. And, China has their 2025 Silk Road Initiative in play. Okay. So China really doesn't want to be the world's manufacturing floor anymore. They want to be more known for their high-tech products, rare earth minerals, computer chips, things like that. And I think just, American companies and companies around the world just realize now that, they need to resource and take a look at their supply chain. And sometimes it's not easy. We have a client in Brooklyn, New York, who brings in cell phone accessories, maybe 20 to 30 containers a month. That client moved 50% of their production from China a year and a half ago, put 25% in Vietnam and the other 25% in Myanmar. Okay. And there were no tariffs. So they didn't get hit with a 25% tariff duty, and their shipping costs, while still expensive, were not off the charts like they were for cargo coming right out of China. So Jason, I think you're probably going to have some thoughts on that as well.
No, I mean, honestly, really great points. And that's, we talked about that a little bit. I mentioned the 301 tariffs, and that's the Trump tariffs. And that the highest tier was 25% that was slapping on items. And so just with that, companies that we got a company who is supplying it's like a humidifier. And it was the second business for the owner. And they just were, they kept ramping up, how much they were shipping because it was selling, and they were able to get it, in China at a good cost. But the Trump tariffs pretty much wiped out their ability to make a profit on it. And then as soon as the shipping expenses kind of came into play, they shut the whole company down. I mean, they can't do it anymore. And we talked with them about switching sourcing locations. And, for a larger company, it can be easier to do that. But, when you switch sourcing, there's a lot of unknown expenses. It's really hard to get your total cost of that project and also your timeline too, because generally speaking, you can't just make the same thing without problems. And so whenever you switch countries, and especially if you're not coming back to the US, if you're going to a different language, different culture, there's just going to be things that don't line up. And yeah, so we, in terms of the US, we have some manufacturing areas that we're really good at. For example, there's a beer manufacturer here in Michigan who sources all of their cans from the US. They actually had to go to Malaysia because this was last year. We had an aluminum can shortage. And that was actually a funny story. That was due to seltzers taking off. Seltzers got so popular, they sucked up all the cans. And this Michigan beer company had to go to Malaysia and spend a substantial amount more per can. Actually, it's pretty interesting. But yeah, there's areas where we are very effective here in the States, but not all the areas. So that's why I think the idea of getting into Mexico, getting into Canada is great. You can cut out at least one link of the supply chain, which has been the container cartels, which I'd love to get people away from. Or at the very minimum, South America, Brazil, and that's at least a shorter trip and a lot cheaper and a different flow of capacity. But
yeah, absolutely, Jason. And one last thing about that too is the cost of labor. So of course, here in America, I can tell you right now, I have a friend that owns a cashew nut farm in Mozambique, Africa. And this gentleman worked for Hewlett Packard for 30 years, and he became a missionary, moved to Mozambique, Africa, bought a cashew nut farm. And now his brand of cashews is sold all throughout the country. It's called Sunshine Nut. And he houses 600 workers on that plantation. And those workers are some of the most highly paid people in Mozambique. But their annual income in 1 year per worker is only $1,000 US. Okay. Compared to, imagine us having a cashew nut farm here in America, and imagine what, we'd have to pay people here in America, so It's a real big comparison and contrast. So labor is another big thing. Yeah, we want to buy American, made in America, but the cost of labor to produce the goods is a prohibitive factor. But I do think that's going to start to change.
Oh, for sure.
Mike, back to you.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I've learned a lot. It tells us and lets us know how complicated this issue is. And I think our audience has really enjoyed this. But I would be remiss if I did not mention the next Humankind event, which will take place at Manastee's Vogue Theater. West Shore is proud to have a really strong relationship with the Vogue. You can visit the Humankind webpage for a full list of movies with a brief description. But this coming Wednesday on March 2nd at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m., The Red Shoes will be shown. This will be followed by Mad Max Fury Road, if you remember that from a few years ago, and that's the following week on March 8th at 7 p.m. All of these films are free and open to the public, and don't miss Annie Holmes' exhibition, Can't See the Forest for the Trees. It's open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 12 till 4 at the Old Kirk Museum in Manistee through March 18th. You can see a full listing of these and other upcoming Humankind events by visiting West Shore's website. Once you've visited the website, choose Humankind under the community drop-down menu. And I have one more request for people who are here. Please, as you leave this Zoom session, you'll be asked to click on a link to a survey that'll allow you to comment on this presentation. It's very important and helpful for us. So please know what you liked about the presentation, as well as any opportunities we could implement to improve the viewer experience. Let me say thank you once again to Jason and Anthony, both from Supply Chain Solutions. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight. Thank you so much. And good night and have a pleasant tomorrow. Is that what they used to say on SNL? I'm dating myself, but so yeah, okay.
Oh,
All
man.
the best. It's a pleasure, and invite us back anytime.
Okay, thank you so much.
Take care, guys.
Really appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Bye-bye now.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. There we go.